Good morning, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Bill Ross, president of the North Shore Senior Center Men's Club, and today's program is a Montgomery, Alabama trip. As usual, we'll be using the Zoom app. Now, everyone will be initially muted, but you can ask questions using Zoom's chat feature. Simply click on chat, which is located on the Zoom control panel at the bottom of your screen, and type in your question. The speaker will answer them at the end of the presentation, depending upon time constraints. Again, just to remind you, for those not familiar with Zoom, if you wish to view the speaker clearly, you should click on Speaker View at the top of your screen. However, this is recommended especially for this program so you can see the presentation. Remember, in any event, if people can see you, so be careful. Now, following today's presentation, we will have a men's club business meeting. I invite all of you to stay connected to learn what has been going on since last we met. I promise that we will try to keep this meeting to be short but informative. The business meeting will be held on the last Tuesday of each month, as long as we're meeting via Zoom rather than at the center. And now, let me turn the session over to Jay Goldman from the Men's Club Program Committee, who will tell you about future programs and introduce today's speaker. Jay?
Good morning, all. Today, let me tell you about some things upcoming, first of all. If you have the catalog, you will see in there that for next week, Patty O'Mahony was scheduled, but she had to bow out because of sickness in the family. And so I got Julie Mann, who is the managing editor of WBBM News Radio. And so she will be filling in on, and her subject will be reporting during the pandemic, and should be very interesting. Then on the second Tuesday of September, that's September the 8th, Claudia Cabrera, who is with the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, is going to be talking about the state of homelessness in Chicago and the U.S. and what we can do about it. And then on the 15th of September, Michael Greenberg is going to be talking about the tables turned on them, Jewish GIs guarding Nazi POs in the United States. And I'll leave it at that, and let's get to our speaker today. Her name is Nina Kavan, and you'll notice when she speaks, you'll catch a certain accent, and it happens to be South African. That's where she was born. Anyway, she's also spent time with the Anti-Defamation League. Her career has been involved in PR, and so I think you're going to find this a very, very interesting program. Let me get it. Okay, Nina. Nina, you're on.
Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. Thank you, Jay, so much for having me today to speak today. I have a Facebook group and a website, basically an organization here in Evanston called Dear Evanston. And it's about 5 years old. It came out of a leadership program through the Evanston Community Foundation, which I'll tell you a little bit about during the presentation. But I focus on issues of race and equity in Evanston. Initially, it was on race, equity, and youth gun violence in Evanston, because youth gun violence is a result of, so much inequity in our society, racial inequity. So I've been doing that for 5 years, and this trip that I'm going to tell you about was done and organized under the auspices of my organization. So I'm going to share the screen, and I'm hoping it all works. So
that's perfect. Thanks.
There we go.
All right. So on September 13th, almost a year ago, 100 of us boarded 2 buses to go to Montgomery, Alabama, to visit the Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And it's unbelievable to me that this was a year ago, and we went there to examine and talk about racial issues in America. And the year that has followed our journey is a year that has turned us all even more upside down than we were. So when I was looking through this presentation yesterday, I just, it's really amazing how much has changed through COVID, what COVID has shown us about racial inequities in healthcare and economic injustice. And, just a couple of days ago, I live in Evanston, and just 2 days ago, a young man was shot in Kenosha 7 times in the back by police officers. So our work is really, really cut out for us, and that was part of what the purpose of this trip was. So I just wanted to say that, given my hindsight now, a year later, is very interesting to revisit this. So here's my presentation. Lifelong Evanstonian Letitia Barge bought a bottle of bubbles to Montgomery, Alabama. Outside the Legacy Museum, the morning after our long bus ride from Evanston, she waved her wand high to release buoyant bubbles into the humid air. On Sunday, crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Letitia's bubbles wafted weightless over the waters of the Alabama River, each a perfect, round, floating world. I'm releasing souls, she told me. 2 summers ago, I came across an article about a brand new museum and memorial that were being built to acknowledge the brutality of slavery, honor and remember its victims and victims of racial terror lynchings, and address the ongoing scourge of systemic and everyday racism today. The museum and memorial were the brainchild of attorney and author Bryan Stevenson, one of my true heroes. Stevenson is Stevenson is revered for founding the Equal Justice Initiative, which is committed to ending mass incarceration and excessive punishment in the United States, to challenging racial and economic justice, and to protecting basic human rights for the most vulnerable people in American society. Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption, talks about his work defending mostly poor African-American prisoners, most of them on death row. His work forced him to experience close up the racism in our justice system that results in disproportionate numbers of Black and low-income people being incarcerated and sentenced to die. And probably many of you saw the movie that came out, which came out after our trip to Montgomery. So based on his work, Stevenson offers 4 approaches to fighting racial injustice. Number 1, get proximate. You can't solve problems or make assessments from a distance. You need to understand the nuances and the details. Number 2, get uncomfortable. We are all broken, and in brokenness, we understand something about compassion. To truly fight for justice, we must be prepared for an uncomfortable journey. Number 3, change the narrative. We must begin to talk about the ills of the past and their connection to today. Truth and reconciliation as a nation are all needed before we can begin to change the American narrative on race. Number 4, embrace hope. Despite the myriad headlines of growing inequality and racial tensions, Stevenson cautions against reacting with despair and to instead protect our hope quotient. Hope is what gets you to stand when other people say, sit down, he says. Hope is what gets you to speak when other people say, be quiet. Everything about Bryan Stevenson's work and his approach spoke to me when I first read his book 4 years ago, well, now 5 years ago. And now this museum and memorial. So I grew up in South Africa. I was born in 1964 during apartheid. My childhood was spent against the backdrop of signs on benches, buses, bathrooms, and beaches that said for whites only and for non-whites. And that was the least of apartheid's atrocities. Just 7 years later, after apartheid ended in 2001, the Apartheid Museum opened in Johannesburg. I am Jewish. My grandparents lost almost all their family at Auschwitz extermination camp in Poland during the Holocaust. Auschwitz became a memorial site in 1947, just 2 years after the end of the Holocaust. Sites like this and many others have stood for decades as monuments to the 6 million Jews and others who were murdered by the Nazis. There are Holocaust museums around the world, including one right here near where I live in Skokie. I am an American. Though I'm an immigrant, I live in and benefit from the bounty of a country that was built with the blood, sweat, and tears of millions of Africans. They were captured, whipped, shipped, separated from family, enslaved, sold, bartered, and lynched. But unlike South Africa and Germany, though this country's brutal history of slavery ended 154 years ago, until just 3 years ago, no comprehensive museum and monument stood to acknowledge slavery, lynching, the fight for civil rights, and the tragedy of mass incarceration today. I'm an Evanstonian. For 20 years, I lived in Northwest Evanston, the city where my Northwestern University graduate husband and I chose to raise our kids, like so many other white people, because of its diversity. Like so many other white people, I knew little about Evanston's history or the Black community on whose backs we white folks celebrate that diversity. Though the signs of my childhood in South Africa aren't here, we are still significantly and unacceptably divided by race and socioeconomics in Evanston. So I read Brian Stevenson's book when I participated in the Evanston Community Foundation's program called Leadership Evanston. It set a fire under me to get proximate, to get uncomfortable, to learn a new narrative, to know the real story of Evanston about how and why our city is so segregated. As I learned, I also met and became friends with many outstanding, resilient, talented Black residents, many of whose families have been here longer than Evanston's white residents, often because their families fled racial terror in the South. I've listened to their stories, horrific stories of exclusion and inequity, and powerful testimonials of survival against the odds. All of that is to say that though I didn't know it, I had been waiting for this museum and memorial forever. I'd also learned that there is a direct connection between Evanston and the museum that made it all the more imperative to visit. Anthony Crawford, whose story is featured there, was the great-great-father of the late Evanston resident and historian Doria Johnson, and Colette Allen, who is an Evanston resident born and raised, and who is the executive director of Family Focus, which was founded in Evanston by Alderman Dolores Holmes and Bernice Weisbord. On October the 21st, 1916, a white mob beat, stabbed, shot, and hanged 56-year-old Anthony Crawford in the town square of Abbeville, South Carolina, after he dared to argue with a white merchant over the price of cottonseed. Crawford had a large, multi-generational family and was a successful farmer who owned 427 acres of land. Days after the lynching, Abbeville's white residents voted to expel the Crawford family and seize their property. When South Carolina's governor declared himself powerless to protect the family from violence, most of Crawford's surviving relatives fled to New York and Illinois, and many Black Evanstonians traced their roots back to Abbeville. I knew that the only way I was willing to visit Montgomery was with my whole community, those who would appreciate the opportunity to honor their ancestors and their history, and those like me who are obligated to bear witness to our country's brutality and to our neighbors' devastating losses and the injustices they have faced for 400 years and counting. I was uncompromising in about four things. First, participants had to come from racially and socioeconomically diverse backgrounds and be diverse in age and gender. Second, visiting the museum would have to be financially accessible to anyone who wanted to go. Third, we needed to understand clearly that we would be witnesses, supporters, and friends to our Black brothers and sisters whose history we would honor alongside them. That it wasn't about us, white, Latinx, non-Black participants, other than to listen, recognize the damage done and still being done by white supremacy, and consider what each of us can do to help repair the past. Number 4, we had to go by bus. It would be the most economical way to travel. It would force us all to get proximate, uncomfortable both physically and emotionally, and learn a new narrative. It would encourage us to make social, business, and activist connections across race and socioeconomics. It would be a journey rather than a trip, and it would be a symbolic hat tip to Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott, and the courageous freedom riders of the civil rights movement. So that's a piece of my story and my dream for this journey and how it came to be. 99 other participants have their own stories and their own reasons for signing up, and their own experiences in Alabama, and their own takeaways now that we are home. I wish that I could have had this presentation and have, 4 other people talk about it from their perspective, because we all came away based, depending on our race, our age, with different experiences. So on the evening of Friday, September 13th, 100 of us boarded 2 buses for a 16-hour each way drive to Montgomery to visit the Legacy Museum and Memorial, and to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. We were friends and strangers, Black and white, people of color, even lifelong Evanstonians, and transplants from other cities and countries. We were well off and privileged, low and fixed income. We were teachers, police officers, volunteers, doctors, activists, lawyers, students, chefs, social workers, employed, unemployed, parents, and entrepreneurs. The youngest of us was 18, the oldest was 82. Even people who weren't on our buses were a vital part of our journey. Generous donors, our friends, neighbors, Facebook followers, local businesses raised more than $12,000 to cover the $300 per person cost of the journey for the 40% of us who didn't have the funds to spare. Boxes of bagels and bags of bananas and clementines, croissants, cookies, and donuts were donated. Our commemorative t-shirts were gifted to us. We prepared very carefully for our experience. Each participant was required to read 2 important books: White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism by Robin DiAngelo, and of course, Stevenson's Just Mercy. During 2 pre-journey gatherings, facilitators helped us to get to know each other, prepare for our experiences as a diverse group, the different ways we might process the journey, and set expectations for how to respect one another's experiences. 5th generation Evanston resident Gilo Logan, who's on the left, graciously opened each gathering with a powerful and moving ceremony. Pastor Michael Neighbors, president of the NAACP and senior pastor at Second Baptist Church, he's in the middle, blessed our journey and told us about his pilgrimage in 1992 to Gorée Island, Senegal, where captured slaves were held before crossing the ocean to America. Dino Robinson, on the right, is the founder of Shorefront Legacy Center. He provided local Black history to contextualize our journey. And he is the founder of Shorefront Legacy Center, which archives Black history along the North Shore. As we loaded and boarded our buses in the Evanston Township High School parking lot, replete with a send-off by community members and leaders and a surprise police escort down Church Street and McCormick Boulevard, I breathed what felt like my first breath since our team began to plan for this moment 3 months earlier. And this is our team. I felt humbled and grateful and proud. Thanks to an amazing, dedicated team from left to right, Kimberly Holmes-Ross, actually it's not left to right, but it's Kimberly Holmes-Ross and Evan Finnemore, Jennifer Moran, and Kathleen Long, and our amazing travel agent, Felicia Brandon, who lives in Alabama, but who actually had lived in Evanston and is an African-American woman. And all the folks who had entrusted this journey to us, the dream I'd dreamed 3 years ago had materialized. Logistics-wise, it really helped that Evan, Kathleen, and I were old pros at this whole bus thing, having organized 4 buses of Evanstonians, 200 people, to go to Washington, D.C. for the Women's March following Trump's inauguration. And I'm hoping we won't have to do that again. A year later, we bussed another group of Evanstonians to Springfield to protest gun violence and call for stronger gun legislation. Kim's outreach skills, enthusiasm, and her connection to our African-American community were instrumental in the outpouring of interest we received. And Jennifer's deep involvement with the Moran Center, which is an organization in Evanston that works to prevent the school-to-prison pipeline, and her leadership of Leadership Evanston helped us develop very important pre-journey discussions. The group of us met, texted, talked, and emailed one another morning, noon, and night for the entire summer last summer. Somehow Felicia, the travel agent, kept up with our craziness. I don't know how she managed it, but she kept us on track. So here we were, 100 souls, each with our own story, settling into our seats as the sun started setting and we set our sights on the south. Each of us with our own reasons for registering for this uncomfortable journey and to grapple with what we can do together to set things right. And there we were as we were approaching Montgomery. We arrived at our hotel, crumpled, but not much worse for wear, at about 9:30 on Saturday morning. It was hot, and our hotel, despite all our planning, wasn't as ready for us as we would have liked, to say the least, but that's another story. We handed out lunches that had been donated and we had brought from Evanston, catered by Wendy and Clarence Weaver, who own a small convenience store on the corner of Church and Dodge in Evanston, which is the center of the Fifth Ward, the historic Black community. Some of us managed a quick shower and change of clothes, and by 12:30, our group stood in line to enter the Legacy Museum. The museum is an 11,000 square foot building, and it's built on the site of a former warehouse where enslaved Black people were imprisoned. It's located midway between a historic slave market and the main river dock and train station, where tens of thousands of enslaved people were trafficked during the height of the domestic slave trade. By 1860, Montgomery was the capital of the domestic slave trade in Alabama, one of the 2 largest slave-owning states in America. And last year, in October, Montgomery elected its first Black mayor. The museum is powerful, and I just have to tell you, I don't have very many photos from the museum because photography inside the museum is prohibited. So the museum is packed and powerful, and there are dramatic images and information about America's history of racial injustice and its legacy. Through art, film, sculpture, and photography, you're confronted by stark and emotional truths about the legacy of racial inequality and about the truth and reconciliation that must happen in order for us to find real solutions to contemporary problems. Soon after you enter the museum, you're greeted by a dark passageway with slave pen replicas. Here you can see, hear, and get close to what it was like to be imprisoned and awaiting sale at the nearby auction block. Holograms of enslaved women, children, and men narrate first-person accounts of the sights and sounds of the domestic slave trade. Extensive research helps you understand the racial terrorism of lynching, the humiliation of the Jim Crow South, and today's scourge of police brutality and mass incarceration. In one area of the museum is a stunning display of jars filled with soil collected from sites around the country where lynchings took place. Again, Evanston's connection to the South confronted us. Everyone in our group went at their own pace to take in as much as we could of the museum's exhibits. A few participants were overwhelmed with emotion and had to step out into the daylight to breathe. We then made our own way alone, in pairs, in groups, to the memorial, which is a short walk or shuttle bus ride from the museum. The memorial is breathtaking. No, sorry, I skipped a. So here's the jar of earth from where Anthony Crawford was lynched. So the memorial is breathtaking. It's expansive, somber, sad, and hopeful. It's a mixture of earth and grass and flowers, of poetry and prose. Of agonizingly beautiful, painful sculptures. And rows of 800 steel monuments that look like rusty copper coffins. At first you encounter, and I want to just tell you quickly a little bit about this man, Bruce King, who's a good friend of mine. His grandfather came from the South, and he came as a very young man, escaping the South because he had just turned 19 at a time when boys had to then start wearing long pants, he always tells me, and he was walking on the sidewalk and some white people were walking towards him and he didn't step off the sidewalk. And so they threatened him and said people were going to come and get him. And so he was stolen away in a coffin by family and friends, and he came to Evanston that way. He got on a train and came to Evanston. So this was very, very emotional for Bruce and for many of the people who came with us. At first, you encounter these coffins at eye level. But as you walk further, they begin to rise overhead so that you feel as though you're walking beneath the thousands of victims of the noose. Each monument represents a location in the United States where a racial terror lynching took place between 1877 and 1950, and the names and dates of each lynching victim are engraved on each monument. So these were some of the stories that were shown about of the more than 90 Black men, women, and children who had been lynched, many of them for the smallest transgressions. So you can see David Walker, his wife, and their 4 children were lynched in Hickman, Kentucky in 1908 after Mr. Walker was accused of using inappropriate language with a white woman. And Henry Smith, 17, was lynched in Paris, Texas in 1893 before a mob of 10,000 people. And, 3 brothers with the surname Sylvester were lynched in Proctor, West Virginia in 1886 after they were accused of theft. And you can see the rest. Finally, there's the monument park that holds rows of duplicate monuments that are waiting to be claimed, transported, and publicly installed in the counties they represent as a public recognition of the past and step toward a hopeful future of truth, repair, and reconciliation. So that evening, with hope in mind, we ended our intense day of reckoning with a relaxed dinner at Martha's, a local restaurant with delicious Southern buffet. I ate a lot that night. Mostly I remember the banana pudding and the fellowship in the room that night. We provided some optional questions for discussion at each table. Later, when we got back to the hotel, most of the older folks went to bed. And yes, a lot of the younger folks went out and about in Montgomery. We woke up really early the next morning and boarded buses, our 2 buses, and drove the 45 minutes to Selma and to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And on the way, we sat silent as we listened to a recording of Martin Luther King's speech.
We have walked through desolate valleys, and across dry hills. We have walked on meandering highways, and rested our bodies on rocky byways. Some of our faces have learned from the outpourings of the sweltering sun. Some have literally slept in the mud.
And then we arrived at the bridge. Still named after a grand dragon of the KKK, the Edmund Pettus Bridge stands as a symbol of the momentous changes that took place in Alabama, America, and the world in 1965. And of course, all of us have seen the Edmund Pettus Bridge just in the last couple of weeks, mourning the loss of John Lewis. And it was so emotional for me. And I felt so lucky to have seen it and crossed it, while John Lewis was still alive. And there is a movement now to change the name of the Edmund Pettus Bridge to the John Lewis Bridge. So this, the bridge stands as a memorial to the pain and the perseverance and the power and hope of the 600 courageous marchers who tried to cross the bridge on March the 7th, 1964, to demand the right to vote on the day that became known as Bloody Sunday, and who successfully resumed the march 2 weeks later with 3,200 people. They headed east out of Selma, across the bridge, and onto Montgomery. By the time they reached the capital on March 25th, they were 25,000 strong. Less than 5 months later, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Sorry, I misspoke, 1965. It was incredibly moving, our group together, all wearing our T-shirts, all different ages and colors. And this is Alderman Dolores Holmes and her grandson. So she, her grandson, and her daughter were all on the trip, 3 generations. All different ages and colors. Walking across the bridge with all its history of pain and perseverance. And most of all, of hope. There is a Hebrew song I learned when I was a kid by Nachman of Breslov, a Hasidic Jew who lived in the 18th century. The whole world is a narrow bridge, and the most important thing is not to be afraid. I sang it all the way to the other side. Exhausted but energized, we boarded our buses again and headed home, passing cotton fields soaked with the sweat and agony of so many. Together, we sang "Lift Every Voice and Sing," the Black National Anthem.
Sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song, fill up the faith that the darkness has taught us. Sing a song, full of the hope that the present.
We also heard from Jane Grover and Dolores Holmes, who are members of Evanston's Equity and Empowerment Commission, about the push for reparations in Evanston. And back then, it was just a push for reparations. Evanston, since then, has become the first municipality in the country to pass a reparations initiative. And in fact, on Thursday, we're having a third town hall because the National Reparations Committee and Sheila Jackson Lee, who sponsored HB 40, which is the bill calling for a study of reparations, is going to be speaking at it, and that's on Thursday. So that's also since the trip. This trip came at a very, very historic moment for us. We shared stories and reflections. We shared stories and reflections. We wrote poetry and read it. That came to us at the moment while in the bus. We laughed and cried and we slept. As I sit on the bus headed back to Chicago, I begin to reflect on this incredible journey participant Mandy Eason posted on Facebook as our buses glided home. I cannot begin to put into words how powerful this trip has been. I've experienced sadness, anger, pain, empowerment, awe, disgust, heartbreak, and reverence. This trip was about so much more than absorbing facts about enslavement and mass incarceration and segregation and Jim Crow. This was about connecting with the pain and suffering of my ancestors. This journey was everything I predicted and so much more. I hope for everyone who went that their purpose for going was fulfilled. I hope we can all take this experience and not only process it in a healthy, healing, and enlightening and empowering way, but somehow make intentional efforts to pass that on to our children, families, and friends. As we attempt to move forward in the present, we must understand, feel, and learn from the past. So we arrived home at about 1:30 in the morning, and as we hugged goodbye, I knew that truths had been told, friendships forged, bridges built, and seeds sown in so many of us to get involved or more involved in working for racial and socioeconomic justice in Evanston. And our trip, I think, really caught the attention of a lot of people. We were on the front page of the Sunday Chicago Tribune, the Daily Northwestern wrote about us, the Evanston Roundtable wrote about us, we were on WBBM AM, and I got lots and lots of requests from people, to consult with them about how to do a trip like this. So I'm going to end. These were our sponsors, the NAACP, Evanston Cradle to Career, and the Evanston Community Foundation. And I'm going to end with the words that are inscribed on the wall one of the walls at the memorial. For the hanged and the beaten, the shot, drowned, and burned, for those abandoned by rule of law, we will remember. With hope, because hopelessness is the enemy of justice. With courage, because peace requires bravery. With faith, because we shall overcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nina. That was outstanding. And I have one question for you, and I think I know the answer. Was John Lewis by any chance there when you were at the bridge?
He was not there. He was there in spirit, in all of us.
Of course, right. It's too bad that he wasn't there.
No, he wasn't there, and Brian Stevenson was not available when we were at the museum.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you so much for listening.
And you've got some other people I know that have questions. So Go ahead, Jill.
Thank you so much, Nina. That was really powerful. The first question I see is from Ron. It said, most protests against racial injustice are civil, but they have also triggered criminal actions. Clips of riots are used out of context to stoke racial unrest for political gain. Would suspending even legal protests during this election better help the cause? What's your opinion?
My opinion is no. I believe strongly in the right to protest. I do have trouble with the looting that has been going on with protests. I understand the anger by a lot of people. I do understand the desire to loot, to burn, because there's so much hopelessness. I do think that there have been times when that has been usurped by people who are just trying to cause unrest for no good reason. But no, I think protests are really important to a democracy, and especially now.
Thank you. Don has a question. I'm going to try to unmute him, if possible. I'm not sure if he can unmute himself. Here. Yes, now I can.
Okay. Nina, that was a very good presentation. And I think all 100 of you that went there to Montgomery went with a similar attitude, very much together, same feelings of racial equality. The challenge, of course, is to change the hearts and minds of a lot of people who still harbor racist attitudes, both in the South and in the North. And I think it's important to remember the past, just like a lot of us who visit the Holocaust Museum, and you showed Auschwitz. I think it's important. We don't want to forget that. We never should forget it. But I think my question has to do with the present. As I look around today, I see so many role models in the African American community. I see college professors and judges and scientists and lawyers, all kinds of professional people. I see business people. I see CEOs of major corporations who are African American. Not all of them were born to privilege, these African Americans. They worked their way out of the ghetto, if that's in a lot of cases. Military generals and admirals. I mean, I see a lot of progress. We still got a ways to go. My question is this: I hear stories about in the south and west side of Chicago. Well, if we only had a job, and I would like to ask you, in your opinion, there is an opportunity for anybody to rise following those role models if they stay in school and if they have a chosen job in mind to learn what skills are necessary. Why can't that happen? What's the stumbling block for the many, many people who are not held back? We don't have any lynchings in Chicago here. Those are terrible things. But what's holding back the opportunities that African Americans in the Chicagoland have to follow those role models that are making progress today all over the country?
Well, thank you for the question. And I think that it's a really, really there's a really complex answer. And I think that, yes, there are a lot of role models in the African American community. But at the same time, I don't think that while we have come far, I don't think we've come as far as we'd like to believe. And I do think there are lynchings today. I think if you look at police brutality, and just 2 days ago, a young man was shot 7 times at close point blank range in the back in Kenosha. That's not okay. It doesn't happen to white people. And I think that if you look at the western and south sides of Chicago, or you look at particular parts of Evanston, the situation that's going on today, yes, there are role models, and there are role models in all kinds of communities, but slavery and enslavement has just evolved into redlining and Jim Crow. There's such a legacy of racism. The fact that schools aren't supported financially in those areas, the fact that there are food deserts. Even in Evanston, which is a small city, 75,000 people, the Black community in Evanston had a school. During desegregation, it was closed. Kids were bused to white areas to diversify white areas. They were no longer in their strong community that supported them with a great school. That disappeared. The library in the Fifth Ward, after desegregation, they closed it. Kids had to find their way to white areas to go to libraries. The YMCA that Black people in Evanston had to go to, called the Emerson Y, after desegregation, it was closed. Their community, in the name of desegregation, was pretty much decimated. And I think that there are so many reasons. I'm not an expert on all of this, but I think that you compared the Holocaust, and I think that as Jewish people, we have the privilege of having white skin. Jews who have white skin, many of whom live in this country, we got by because of our white skin in many instances. I also think that, if you look at slavery and the fact that people were just pulled out of their countries, taken away, their names taken away from them, they weren't allowed to learn how to read. It's a very, very, it's not a comparison that I feel can be made. So I think that there's an enormous amount that has to be overcome before African Americans are given a real chance to progress further than they have, and they have progressed. So I hope that answers a bit of the question.
There is one other thing. Don talked about the West and the Southwest of Chicago. There are so many gangs, and they seem to do better for them, they think, being in the gang, because they get support, they get money, they do all sorts of things, and unless we can stifle that gang arrangement, I don't think we're going to accomplish very much, unfortunately.
I think that also with gangs, a lot has happened with gangs in the last 15 years or so, where there used to be a gang structure and gang leaders, and there was a concerted effort to arrest gang leaders, and it left gangs unled. And so now, instead of sort of big opposing gangs, there are lots of smaller, what they call cliques. And because there's so little opportunity in those areas, I met my husband at an organization called Jobs for Youth. And I think I mentioned that. And we worked with young kids, mostly Black, almost all from Cabrini Green. They had not been to the Loop. We were on Wabash. There's just so little interest in working with that group of people, and they have so little that of course they're going to go somewhere that promises them support and money. And you're right, it is a huge problem. And I think that investing in communities is part of what can help reduce gang activity.
Thank you. Marty actually had a comment saying last hired, first fired still exists in the USA. There is much racism still within the white community among people who don't know that they are racist. So that was on a similar note.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jane says, well, great journey. Thank you for sharing it. Rita says, thank you for the wonderful presentation. Joe says, great presentation. Thank you. You made reference to redlining. However, why do you think Evanston to this day is still largely segregated communities?
That is it's a really good question. I think, first of all, because racism still exists today. I think there are stories even in Evanston. I love the way I say even in Evanston. That's how all Evanston people say even in Evanston, because the feeling in Evanston is when you come to live here, you know, you're in Heavenston, and it's not true. There's still racial steering by realtors who sort of, you know, direct you to better communities. It's very difficult to afford housing. The Black community in Evanston is reducing by a lot. I think in the last 10 years, it's gone from like 18% to 12% because of the housing prices. So they are housed out. They're priced out of houses, and they go and live in further flung communities like Zion, and, you know, they still have very, very strong connections to Evanston. But I think it's mostly to do with income and the lack of ability to purchase property and feeling unwelcome in white neighborhoods. There is a lot of racism. People don't want to think about it, but there are attitudes, you know, even when it's not overt, but just when somebody's looked at in a certain way, or when a Black person is walking in a neighborhood in Evanston and somebody asks them if they're lost, you know, things like that happen. And so our reparations, interestingly enough, our reparations initiative, the very first issue that they are addressing is housing. And they're working on figuring out how to offer loans or grants, I can't remember exactly which it is, to people who can show that they were discriminated against and who have a history in Evanston. So we are starting with housing.
Oh, thank you again. I just see one more question, and it's about next week's program, actually, and I think it's for Jay. I can ask him later. But I don't see any more here, Nina. I'm just going to unmute Bill and Jay if they're, yeah. Once again, thank you. That was just such an interesting program, and I feel like I want to go on that trip.
Well, you know, looking back at it, during COVID, and I think of all of us scrunched up in buses for 16 hours, 2 ways, and it also just the political situation now and then, it's really been an unbelievably crazy year. Like the concept of getting on a bus and sitting next to somebody is so foreign right now. So I'm glad we did it when we did it.
Again, Nina, thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much.
And I think it's something that we all needed to hear. And I appreciate your coming.
Thank you.